This is a critical year for the future of democracy. Half the world's population will go to the polls in 2024, at a time when citizens in America and across the globe are losing faith in democratic institutions, and autocracies like Russia and China are undermining the international system built on democratic ideals. We often view the rollback of democracy and threats to the liberal international order as separate problems, but they are closely interlinked. The Middle East Institute's new podcast explores the interplay between democracy's domestic and international foes, as well as how to counter them. I'm Gonul, and this is Rethinking Democracy. According to the World Justice Project, 2023 was the 6th year in a row in which the rule of law has declined in most countries. More than 6 billion people live in a country where the rule of law experienced worrying recessions. The rule of law is a cornerstone of democratic societies. It promotes fairness and ensures accountability. Although democracy and the rule of law are closely interlinked and mutually reinforcing, they are distinct concepts, and they can exist independently in different countries. On today's episode, we will be discussing the relationship between the rule of law and democracy, why the rule of law is challenged in places like the Middle East, and whether the West can help advance it. Welcome to the second episode of Rethinking Democracy with Gonul. Joining me today is Dr. Vali Nasr and Thomas Carothers. Dr. Nasr is a professor of international affairs and Middle East studies at the Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies. Thomas Carothers is the co-director of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace's Democracy, Conflict and Governance program. He's a leading expert on comparative democratization and international support for democracy. Tom, Vali, thanks for joining me today.
Good to be with you.
Thank you.
The rule of law is not a new idea, but it is receiving so much attention these days, especially in foreign policy discussions. It's offered as this magic formula to every policy problem, from democratic consolidation to economic development and building stable societies. But the concept has evolved over time, and different countries and societies have created their own interpretations based on their unique historical, political, and cultural context. Tom, I would like to start with you. You worked on these issues both as a practitioner and a researcher. So I want to ask you, what is the rule of law and what does it look like in practice?
The rule of law is a set of norms and institutions that govern or regulate two critical things in a society. First, the relationship among power holders, horizontally across the power structure, and then vertically between the state and citizens. And they govern or regulate these relationships, the horizontal ones of power and the vertical ones between state and citizen, in accordance with norms like fairness, transparency, equality before the law, non-discrimination, and so forth. And the institutions are familiar to us. They're the institutions of courts, of prosecutors, of, in a sense, parliaments are part of the rule of law as lawmaking bodies, local government, legal institutions, and so forth. So the rule of law is, I say, importantly, it's a set of institutions, it's a set of norms, and it's a set of relationships horizontally across power and vertically. I would just say to start, Gonul, that, when I've given talks over the years in countries, I can tell you that when I say I'm here to talk about democracy, wherever I am, there's often a lot of skepticism. People are like, not really sure I want that. If I say I'm there to talk about rule of law, the people line up and say, tell us how to get that in our society. So we can talk later as we talk about why is it so desirable to people and why is there this thirst for the rule of law in so many places, even as there's often skepticism about democracy.
That's exactly right, and a great point, Tom. No one says that law is not rule of law is something that I do not want. It doesn't have that ideological baggage that we often associate with democracy. We'll come back to that point, but Vali, I want to ask you this question from the perspective of the Middle East. So the concept of the rule of law has deep roots in the Middle East. If you look at contemporary Arab law, it's rooted in the Islamic and Ottoman socio-legal traditions, which predates the Western common law. And Arabs, if you look at several polls, they value the rule of law and they see it as central to social improvement. In fact, one of the catalysts of the Arab uprisings was people's demand for accountable governments. And my question is, but do Arabs, or maybe I should say Muslims in the Middle East, and Westerners understand the same thing by the overall idea of the rule of law?
It's a very good point. I think the way Tom described it very well has many of the elements that also are embedded in the region. I mean, first of all, the concept has deep roots and Islamic history itself. In other words, Islamic law is based on the idea of enabling justice in society and also creating an order. And the idea of Islamic law is basically to provide a just and understandable a set of laws. And in Islamic history, traditionally, rule of law had been positioned as opposed to arbitrary law, which is very much the case under dictatorships today. And, there's a famous sayings of, Sunni law about the fact that, the worst thing that can happen to a society is absence of law. And often sometimes the concept of tyranny was seen as absence of law. So mayhem, chaos is not arbitrary law. We're always seen as something that would not enable Muslims to practice law. And then in the early parts of the modern period, attempts at Western constitutions, from the Tanzimat in Turkey to the constitutional revolution in Iran to Arab constitutions that came after, were all not really democratization movements in the sense that is understood today or we transpose it on them, but they were really efforts at curbing the power of arbitrary rule of monarchs and establish rule of law. And even today, Islamism or Islamic fundamentalism, its promotion of the idea of Sharia, is attractive to a lot of average Muslims because it promises rule of law, as opposed to the kind of arbitrary law that either exists in chaos or exists under dictatorships. So whether it's in Afghanistan or parts of Pakistan or many places, initially populations welcome Islamist groups like the Taliban because they establish some form of rule of law where everybody basically can know what the boundaries of law are and be able to exist under it as equal citizens under the law. And so for Muslims today, Sharia does not, for instance, connote what it does in the West. Sharia is seen as rule of law as opposed to absence of rule of law, whether people live in a secular dictatorships in the Arab world or they live in failed states.
Well, you touched upon several important points. You talked about Sharia, which I will come back to later, and also said efforts to curb the power of rulers in the region, they haven't really led to democratization. Which brings me to my next question for Tom, before we delve further into the role of religion, Islam in particular, in efforts to establish the rule of law in the region. Tom, democracy and the rule of law are two things that are closely interlinked. But what is the exact nature of this relationship? Do you need one to have the other? In other words, is establishing the rule of law necessary to the effective pursuit of democratization?
It's a question that's much debated. In the Western liberal tradition, the rule of law and democracy are essentially intertwined, in that in order to have a democracy, the power holders have to be constrained by something, and that's law, and they have to be accountable to citizens, and that's a legal relationship of accountability organized by elections as well as by other legal means by which citizens hold power holders accountable. And so in the Western liberal tradition, if you have a democracy where power holders are not constrained, say a populist democracy where the leader says, I am the law, I can do whatever I want, put that person in jail, he's an enemy of the people, then that leader is violating the rule of law, not constrained by law as a sense of power. And a populist democracy is not a liberal democracy, implying that it's a democracy integrated with the rule of law. Now, some people have argued, well, you could have rule of law without democracy, and that's actually a pretty big debate. It depends upon what sources of law you look to. And in other parts of the world, some people would say, well, there are sources of religious law, which can be the basis of a rule of law system, which are maybe not rooted in Western liberal democratic norms. And that's where you get into some interesting debates. But in the Western liberal tradition, rule of law and democracy are deeply integrated.
Well, so in the Middle East, for example, you might think of some cases where there is a legal structure. Well, there is some sort of rule of law, but it's not really constraining power holders the way it is in Western liberal tradition. So maybe that is why it hasn't really led to democracy in the region. So it's just a follow-up question. I mean, should activists pursue democratization before they attempt to build rule of law? I mean, should it so therefore logically precede it? Because I can think of many good reasons to favor establishing the rule of law before carrying out democratization. For example, you need to establish order first in order to achieve freedom, right?
Yeah, there's a strong desire on the part of many people to sort of get law first and then democracy can come. The idea is let's get some order here. Let's get a coherent state. Let's get things functioning with some clarity and some order, and then we can build in democratic norms. That sounds good, but there are a couple of problems with that. One is that putting off democracy, saying to the people that, well, we're going to have clarity and order, but you don't really have a voice yet. You're going to have to wait 10 or 20 or 30 or 40 years to be able to say who your leaders are. Citizens in a lot of places don't want to wait, and they'll push to have a voice, and then they'll have to be repressed, and then you have something, tyranny arising. Secondly, the problem with rule of law without democracy is it sort of becomes rule by law, in which leaders use law as an instrument of power, but they're not constrained by it. And so they use the tax authorities, prosecutors, using other legal instruments to persecute people. And they say, we're using the law here. Your tax forms are not right. So this is a completely legal shutdown of your organization. And so rule by law without really accountability and holding power accountable is different than rule of law. So I'm hesitant with this idea that all we really need in a society is rule of law, and democracy can wait indefinitely, both because I think citizens want a voice in many places, and secondly, power tends to corrupt. Absolute power tends to corrupt absolutely. And without legal constraints on the rulers, rule of law becomes rule by law, in which law is more of a hammer than a process of justice.
I want to pick up on that very important concept, rule by law. And Vali, let me turn to you. In the first episode of Rethinking Democracy podcast, I hosted Francis Fukuyama and Paul Salem of the Middle East Institute. I asked Paul why democracy has not taken root in the Middle East. And one of the things he said resonated with me as someone who has worked on Turkey for many years. Paul said the state has played an oversized role in every aspect of society. So an autonomous sphere where civil society and independent bourgeoisie, it couldn't emerge in the region. And that suggests to me that the main reason why democracy escaped the Middle East is lack of institutions to rein in the power of the state. What do you say to that?
I agree with him. The problem in the Middle East is that you have very powerful states, state institutions. They have roots in history. They have accumulated power as a consequence of the political economy and security environment in the region. But social institutions that are required to counterbalance them, held them in check, force them to abide by law, force them to abide by a set of constraints and restrictions and exercise of power are absent. And therefore, we have very powerful states. Some are more effective than others, but we don't actually have a pathway to democracy because democracy requires that balance between state power and social institutions. And also, the fact that we have a powerful states does not necessarily mean that you have rule of law. The problem in the Middle East, I guess, is that you have both powerful states, but ones that are not even constrained by laws that they would implement justly and equitably on the population. So we don't have versions of Singapore, We have more versions of arbitrary dictatorships, which is sort of it's doubly bad for the region.
So you're saying that the mechanism to constrain power of rulers is missing in the region. And I want to pick up on that point, and I want to ask you about the specific political practices in the region. Vali, according to the World Justice Project, the United Arab Emirates, for example, ranks 37 out of 139 countries worldwide on rule of law, which is not a bad place. I mean, Turkey, for example, it ranks 116th. So that means there are defined legal structures in the region. So there's some sort of rule of law that exists, but it clearly is not bolstering democracy the way Western style rule of law does. This also goes back to Tom's point about rule by law. So instead of bolstering democracy, the opposite might be happening in the region, where governments in the region might be using the rule of law not to limit their power, but advance it. So my question, and please, Tom, feel free to weigh in on this as well, can we decouple the rule of law in the region from the larger authoritarian context?
I would say, I think Tom is absolutely right what he said about the importance of democracy and not just law and rule of law versus rule by law. But, in the Middle East, in reality, you could think of three sort of categories. You could have obviously perfect democracy, which, is absent. You could have powerful states that are not democratic, but do provide rule of law to their populations. Or you could think of the worst case, which is that you neither have rule of law, nor do you have democratic rights. And I think the populations sort of depends on where they live. Like in Tunisia, when the Arab Spring started, it started not when a fruit seller set himself on fire, he was not asking for democracy. He was asking for rule of law because he was being shaken down arbitrarily by bureaucrats who wanted a payoff. And so for him, I think if Tunisia would have been UAE, that would have been fine. But people who live under a situation like UAE or Turkey, where they have certain degree of rule of law, they're looking at the next step, which is about actually having democratic rights. But fundamental issue that the question you raised is that I don't believe states have any incentive to become voluntarily democratic. That's kind of a philosophical ideal, political ideal. But states don't become democratic unless they are pushed to share power and to accept restrictions on the exercise of power. And that requires somehow for powerful social institutions to emerge. And that's not easily done. Otherwise, in every country, even in the United States, the president would very much like not to be bound by rule of law or constitution or congressional mandate and to be able to exercise power freely, as we see Donald Trump would like to do. But what prevents that from happening is the existence of powerful social institutions and checks and balances on the power of the executive, on the power of the state. And so, yes, we can theoretically say these have to be decoupled. But unless there is a pathway to say, how do you create restraints on the power of states, on the executive branch of government, that's not going to happen voluntarily.
But then how is it going to happen, Tom? I mean, obviously, because I can easily see an argument that, you need more than institutions to establish the rule of law. And you pointed to that when you said that the rule of law is a combination of norms and institutions. So you can go ahead and establish the institutions, or maybe you can't, without the norms, without the values. And Vali also talked about how powerful social institutions are not there in the Middle East. So how do you deal with that? Some might say that you can foster those values only through establishing institutions. And others might say, well, you can't really establish those institutions without the societal values and norms already in place. So how do you tackle that?
Well, rule of law comes about, really through the rebalancing of power in a society. You go back to the Magna Carta in 1215 in what is now Great Britain. King John was signing something saying that, he and those around him would be constrained in what they do and have to follow certain rules and principles. And this comes about really through citizen activism. We often confuse in our mind and think citizen activism, that must be pro-democratic. But as Vali rightly pointed out, in Tunisia, that burst of citizen activism was sparked by a sense of injustice, unfairness. It wasn't a quest for a democratic voice, it was a quest for fairness and justice. So often citizen activism is actually very much for the rule of law. You think in South Korea, for example, in the last 10 years, there have been outbursts, tremendous citizen anger over corruption in presidential circles that has pushed one president out of power and caused another president to also face some political damage as a result of corruption allegations. And so the citizen activism is trying to establish the rule of law, is trying to say these power holders need to be constrained by norms. They need to be accountable to citizens. They need to have to respect the law. Going back to the United Arab Emirates, it's true that it has a certain clarity of order and a certain coherence of institutions. But if you asked a citizen of that country, do you think the president's brother would be held to account if he were illicitly receiving certain favors from the power establishment in terms of maybe some licenses he gets to establish certain businesses without competing for them fairly? Is the president's brother really going to be held to account? Because if not, then that's rule by law, but it's not rule of law because the central power holders themselves are not being constrained by norms of accountability and fairness. So just to summarize again, citizen activism is the way power ends up being rebalanced. Power holders, as Vali said, don't just give away power and say, oh, you know what, I'll constrain myself. I'm sorry, I've been so unbounded. I'm going to start respecting this court. Instead, there has to be a fight for it. Think in Brazil with Bolsonaro, the fight between him and the Brazilian court system, which was very aggressive in trying to constrain his power. A classic example of a horizontal struggle for power between an existing institution, legal institution, and a political power holder trying hard to break the bounds of legal accountability.
But there was a fight, right,
Yes.
in the Middle East. I mean, the uprisings, as you said, it was mostly about establishing the rule of law. It was about securing government accountability. And yet, autocracies reasserted control in the following years. So what went wrong there?
It's a really big question. It started as a search for accountability and fairness, but it became in many Arab societies a search for voice, for democratic voice. Citizens also wanted to choose; they wanted to have a say. So that's where rule of law and democracy get inextricably interlinked. As citizens, as they push for fairness and accountability, that implies having a voice. It's like, I don't want to just be, I want to have a say in who my leaders are. And if I don't have a say, then those leaders are going to just choose among themselves and perpetuate that rule. And that's not the rule of law. And that's also not democracy. And so, the Arab states struck back against those uprisings. They're powerful institutions with long traditions of repressive power and other forms of state power. And they struck back against the attempt to rebalance power, and it failed, as it has in many other countries in the world that have not succeeded to have democracy. There's nothing unique about what happened with the Arab Spring. It was just an unusually vivid explosion of pent-up citizen demand for greater accountability and for voice in the face of unusually strong institutional structures in the Arab states that had already withstood other challenges to their power for many decades. So it was a very vivid example of this struggle, but not a unique one.
Vali, I also want to hear your take on this. Does citizen activism in the Middle East, does it have a shot at establishing the kind of politically accountable system that we have in the West?
I think, yes, it does. I mean, ultimately, social institutions have to be built on citizen activism. I think the way the discourse is unfolding in the region is not necessarily focused on a particular outcome, like, say, it was in the constitutional revolution in Iran in 1905-06, which was very much focused very clearly on the issue of rule of law. Part of the discourse is on democracy and democratization, seeking elections, seeking voice. Some of it is about regime change, and some of it is about rule of law. There is no very clear pathway going forward. And I also do think that the outside world, the West, which is very much part of this conversation, both in terms of what they promote, what they suggest, what they support, is very key. And in the West, our view of the region is not at all focused on rule of law. We're pushing largely the issue of democracy, which then we see essentially in terms of a single election, the first election, which in the absence of talking about rule of law and building a constitutional framework that would ensure it, ends up basically being an unhappy process. And I want to also, you raise this issue of how do we do this? I mean, and you can correct me, you know about Turkey a lot more. In a very interesting way, when Turkey's accession to Europe was much more of a serious issue, there were certain, injunctions that Europe put on the table that Turkey had to follow. It could not have a military government. It had to have an independent judiciary. It had to have open elections. Even the size of its military had to be fit within certain parameters that Europe put down. And at least for a period, my understanding is that it did open the door for both expansion of rule of law, at least for a period, and also democratic practices. Now, Europeans were not thinking about in terms of democratization or rule of law, but what they asked in terms of what Turkey had to do amounted to creating certain red lines. The United States has not, for instance, put any of these down, if you would, even when it had the opportunity in Iraq. It was all focused on elections, but not on how the Constitution would guarantee rule of law. It has not asked of any of the governments to which it gives tremendous amount of economic and security support to do a tenth of what European Union asked Turkey if it was interested in accession. And so it's partly, we have a convoluted debate here about what the aim is. And that convoluted debate to some extent gets mirrored, if you would, in the region as well.
Well, Vali, you referred to it's an excellent point. You talked about Turkey's experience and how the EU accession played a role in curbing the military's power, in establishing the rule of law. But there's a really interesting dynamic there. I agree that the outside world, the Western world, has an important role to play in advancing democracy and the rule of law in different countries. But in the Turkish case, it's a very strange dynamic where, yes, the EU accession process really helped Turkey's democracy until it didn't. President Erdogan used Turkey's EU accession to actually consolidate his one-man rule. And I think that's why the heart of the matter here is, in the Turkish case, Erdogan managed to use the societal cleavages, the roots of which go back to the 19th century, to consolidate power, to create this polarization. And also, the opposition to Erdogan was not democratic either. So domestic factors played a larger role in Erdogan's efforts to taking an imperfect Turkish democracy and turning it into autocracy. But you also mentioned something else, Vali, and that is, you said that the West is not focusing on building the rule of law in the region. Instead, it's focused on democracy. And Tom, I want to ask you this question. What is the United States doing, or is it doing anything to foster the rule of law in the region? Because, democracy and democracy promotion, they have become dirty words after US invasion of Iraq, but I assume the rule of law does not have that negative connotation. So is promoting the rule of law part of US policy toward the Middle East?
Well, the United States has for many years had assistance programs related to the rule of law in the Middle East and many other regions of the world. Those are, very roughly speaking, of two types. They're kind of technical assistance for courts or prosecutors to help them get trained, to help them get the resources they need, to get the skills they need to do their job. So there's kind of what we call the top-down approach of working directly with institutions. And then there's the more bottom-up approach where you work with citizen groups that are organizing, maybe a group of housing activists who are trying to change a housing law to make it more fair and more just. So you're activating them to helping them activate legal challenges to institutions to perform better. And so you can work on the rule of law from the top down or the bottom up. Of course, governments feel much more comfortable with the top down. If you go to the government of Morocco and say, well, we'd like to do this training program for your judges, we'll fly them to Copenhagen so they can meet some judges in Denmark and see what that's like. Then we'll give them all of these books that are translated into Arabic of that, this and that. They'll say, oh, that all sounds fine. If you say, well, actually, we want to work from the bottom up and we want to work with all these different citizen groups and help them in their struggle to achieve justice, makes people a little less comfortable. And so the United States, unfortunately, for several decades, the Middle East has tended to lean more towards the top down rather than the bottom up, partly because of the amount of political space that's there, and partly because of the kind of comfortable relations the U.S. has with many of the governments or states in the region. So there is rule of law assistance, but it could be sharpened, it could be expanded, and we can't count on the external hand to really solve this issue. I'd like to mention, for example, we've been talking about the Arab world, but let's look at, one of the most active democracies in the Middle East, which is Israel. What's the big struggle in Israeli politics, in domestic politics in Israel? It's about the rule of law. It's about Netanyahu and his government's efforts to limit the power of the judiciary because they don't want to be constrained by it. They want to get through a number of policy measures without the constraints of the rule of law. And so even a country that seems to have threaded the needle of having both democracy and the rule of law, which was Israel, at least for Jewish citizens, finds itself in the middle of a battle royale over the rule of law. So that's where it's important to see that, again, the interlinkage of struggles for democracy and struggles for the rule of law, and how you don't just get the rule of law in place and then it's set and you're fine. Even there, the battle continues.
Well, I want to come back to what Israel is doing and what's happening after October 7th. But Vali, before that, I want to ask you, what do you think about Western efforts to export the rule of law to places like the Middle East, which is very different in many ways? For one, the relationship between law and religion in the Middle East is different, right? About half the world's Muslim majority countries have Sharia-based laws, and Sharia is derived from Islam's holy book, Quran, and sayings and practices of Prophet Muhammad. So Islamic laws are based on interpretations of Sharia. Iran, for example, have Islamic law-based regulations. And the assumption is that Islam should inform the law, whereas in the US, the assumption was that law should facilitate the separation of church and state. So what is your take on that? Is that a big block in terms of what the West can do, or whether it can export the type of rule of law that it has adopted at home to places like the Middle East?
I mean, both what Tom said just now and what you said about Turkey, suggest that this has to be a process. It's not like you're going to get there immediately in one shot. So I would think, most Muslims like the Sharia, not just because it's what they have to abide by based on their religious faith, but because they view it as a system of law that provides a lot of the protections, predictability, accountability, fairness, justice, etc., that they're seeking in their daily lives. So it might be more fruitful in the West to sort of try to engage Muslims, not along, religion, secularism line, but around the fact of what is good law, what is bad law, what does the rule of law mean. But also, not all of the debate in the Middle East is actually about Sharia. In large parts of the Middle East, as we saw during Arab Spring, as we're still seeing in many countries, is about the absence of rule of law. In others, it's about arbitrary rule under dictatorships. It's about, corruption, and corruption is not just financial corruption. Corruption basically also means for people absence of clear, understandable parameters of law. It's about arbitrary authoritarianism. And there's a lot more that the US can do. I mean, the example we were giving about the EU is not that EU can ensure that Turkey will forever remain in accordance with rule of law or democracy, but it suggests that you can force certain openings, at least step one. There is nothing in our relationship with Egypt, with Jordan, with Morocco, with any of the countries that are in dire need of rule of law that suggests that we are actually promoting it at all. And we're not asking of them to sort of institute at least the minimum, let's say, rules and regulations within their constitutions that would guarantee it. Or we're not holding their feet to fire on its practice. So the conversation with these countries become about these large issues that you're either a democracy or you're not. And then the issue of Islam, actually is used to promote arbitrary rule. Because governments like those in Egypt or many other authoritarian countries in the Middle East's argument to the United States is that, we are faced with this threat of Islamic fundamentalism, and therefore that justifies dictatorship. That justifies arresting people, closing down their businesses, doing all manner of things in the name of fighting Islamic fundamentalism. So the bogey of Islam ultimately becomes a way in which we tolerate authoritarianism and arbitrary rule. And then to many in the region, then democracy becomes just like a throwaway thing that we put out there as if we really mean it. And we don't. I mean, there's a lot of steps we can take to try to at least put in place some building blocks of what we've been discussing in this conversation.
Vali, you made a great point, and I want to ask you further on this. You mentioned this discrepancy between theory and practice, and in Turkey too. I mean, yes, the EU forced an institutional change, but then Erdogan took that and used it to consolidate his power in terms of advancing democracy. So you need enlightened leaders, right? I mean, the Arab world, it's very challenging. It's had an exceptionally long experience with authoritarian rule, and they are deeply divided along ethnic, sectarian, and ideological lines. And making matters worse is the extremely challenging security conditions. So all these factors make building rule of law very difficult. But despite all that, constitutionalism and lawmaking have greatly progressed in nearly all countries of the Middle East and North Africa, from Sudan to Algeria and Tunisia. But again, the problem is there is this discrepancy between theory and practice. These laws do not get implemented. To achieve that, you need rulers who are willing to abide by laws. So how do you overcome the huge problem of lack of political will?
To be honest with you, I don't believe in the enlightened ruler as being decisive. Yes, once in a while you end up with somebody like Nelson Mandela. But the problem is, even the most enlightened rulers will arrive at a point where they see it in their greater wisdom that what their country needs requires them to basically break the law or not listen to the parliament. And then they end up in a slippery slope of gradually establishing a principle that the greater good of the country requires you breaking the constitutional rules and rule of law. So at all times, you do need shackles around the ankles of even the most enlightened of rulers. And it's those shackles, I believe, that keeps rulers enlightened. That 2/3 of the people who we think are, great Democrats would have broken the law and acted arbitrarily when they're in a position that they think is justified to do so. And therefore, the case of Turkey, you're right. But what it suggests is not, what Europe started, obviously was not enough. You have to have an ongoing process by which a society that lacks the shackles, lacks social institutions, would gradually develop it, that constitutions become stronger, and that constitutions develop teeth. As the constitutions have to be able to actively limit the powers of rulers. That's a test the United States is going to face if Donald Trump comes back. But what contained him in the first term in office was the Constitution. And so it's good to have leaders that say the right things and like to do that. But those leaders ultimately pass away, move out, lose elections, or that they themselves see it as necessary to break the rule of law when they think it's absolutely urgent to do so. And once you do that, then you're down that slippery slope. Then everybody will become an Erdogan down the road.
I agree with you that constitutions, institutions matter, but I also tend to agree with this notion that institutions are as strong as the people who work for those institutions, right? If they're not committed to the whole democratic process, then there might not be that much for institutions to do in terms of preserving democracy. Tom, I want to switch gears and talk about this relationship between the rule of law and world order. Does erosion of or lack of rule of law at home have international implications? Russia, for instance, invade Ukraine if Russia was a country where Putin is held accountable to laws.
Well, there's two parts to that question in a way, Gonul. The international liberal order is based on the idea of law in the sense that Relations of trade between countries should be organized according to legal agreements in both treaties and individual bilateral agreements between countries. Relations of, how embassies are treated should be ruled by law, how airplanes fly over international skies. The International Liberal Order foresees a vast array of laws that bring countries together and organize interstate relations according to law. It also foresees that leaders in these countries will take law seriously, or they will pay some price for it, either an international price by being excluded from things or a domestic price and so forth. We tend to think there's a general correspondence between leaders who, respect law at home and then respect law internationally. I think there are arguments to be made about that. There may be some leaders who are pretty unlawful at home, but for various reasons feel constrained by the international order and basically respect its rules. There aren't too many examples, although some people might point to the United States, in some cases, a country that's very democratic, but has broken international norms for the sake of its own security interests, like in, invading Iraq, for example. So there isn't an exact correlation, but our idea of world order is very much rooted in law. And so, in a simple sense, the more law there is domestically in all of the states around the world, the more likely we are to have a world order in which law prevails.
Wally, I want to ask you a similar question, a question about domestic determinants of foreign policy behavior of regimes in the Middle East. Does public opinion matter in a region where autocrats can basically ignore their people's preferences? The US, to me, seems to have contradictory assumptions about this. On the one hand, the US is seeking normalization between Israel and Arab countries, thinking that the Arab street that is opposed to the idea will not matter. But on the other hand, it's levying sanctions on Iran, for instance, hoping that economic strangulation of the Iranian people will lead to public pressure on the regime to change its behavior. So do the people of the region have a real political voice, especially when it comes to their government's foreign policy behavior?
What you say about the sort of the US double standard on this is absolutely correct. We only think the Arab people matter when a moment like Arab Spring happens. And then we talk about the region as if the people don't matter at all, and that a few dictators can basically make a decision for the entire region. And sometimes it looks to the region that we only care about the public in countries that we don't like, but not in countries whose foreign policies align with ours. But having said that, I think it does matter, but not in the ways that we see, because even authoritarian regimes, dictatorships, still have to calculate the cost of governance. Now, even though you can bully your people, put them in jail, etc., but the preference is not to spend too much political capital, social capital in trying to enforce unpopular issues on your publics. And if the foreign policy issues become too unpopular, even dictatorships will find it difficult to follow it. There's no public opinion polls, there's no elections to reflect this. Periodically, you have things like the assassination of Anwar Sadat, which showed that there was, at least in a segment of Egyptian population, unhappiness with the Camp David Accords. And I think every authoritarian ruler in the region is careful about how a military coup or an assassination or a riot could challenge a foreign policy decision. But for that reason, if they're going to follow unpopular foreign policy decisions, they would have to become even more authoritarian to protect themselves from it. And that's a cost that then they would have to factor in. And so you could say, demanding of the region to follow unpopular foreign policy courses actually makes the very governments that we're relying on to become more authoritarian in order to be able to deliver on those unpopular foreign policy decisions. So yes, there is a break point. We don't see it. Like we don't see what's the break point in Saudi Arabia or the rest of the region if we push for normalization at the same time as the Gaza war. Or we cannot clearly gauge what even the cost would be to the United States and its friends if the news coming out of the Gaza war is going to make the region increasingly angry. And so we end up relying on dictatorship and security states to basically maintain order as we pursue unpopular foreign policies with the region.
And My last question to both of you, which is somewhat related to this issue of public opinion and how important public opinion is in both US's policy vis-a-vis the region and also the regime's calculation. So since Hamas's October 7th attack, people of the Middle East have taken to the streets in vast numbers to protest both Israel's and Biden administration's responses. So the US's credibility has taken a huge hit. And Arab regimes that normalize ties with Israel or considering normalization are having a difficult time to frame that policy in a way that can calm down the people. So moving forward, what does post-October 7th dynamics tell us about US efforts to advance democracy and rule of law in the region, and what could be the response from the regimes?
Well, I think right now the United States is quite preoccupied with, dealing with the situation in Gaza and then also trying to maintain and in some cases strengthen its relationship with its Arab friends in the region. So this isn't a moment at which the United States is strongly focused on the rule of law. But as Vali says, these tensions that exist in a number of Arab states between citizens' views and government actions is not going to go away. And therefore, it puts pressure on efforts to support democracy and rule of law. What would be a mistake is to interpret this pressure on the part of the U.S. and say, well, we better back away from our efforts to support human rights groups or support activists pushing for the rule of law because we don't want citizens to be too activated and it could be dangerous. I think that would be a mistake. And instead find ways to sort of open up communication between citizens and their states and try to increase channels of transparency and accountability over time. That's going to be a better outcome than trying to suppress the tensions that exist.
Vali?
I agree. I think we will not know what the consequence of this moment is going to be for some time. But you could look at a country like Jordan, which is a very close ally of the United States, and is also has a very tight strategic relationship with Israel, and how it's under so much pressure about how to balance its relationship with a population that is extremely angry, that is being out in the streets protesting in front of the Israeli embassy, and maintaining those alliances that economically and security-wise matter to Jordan, or how to balance, defending Israel when Iranian missiles are going in the direction of Israel, with the fact that a lot of its population probably sympathize with Iran and Palestinians much more than they did with Israel. But you have to say to yourself that what is the break point here? I mean, at what point the kind of pressure that a country like Jordan is facing is likely to all of a sudden create a break? I mean, part of the problem we have in the Middle East is that we see stability until it's not. In other words, everything was stable in Tunisia until it was not. Mubarak was the pharaoh that could rule Egypt forever until he couldn't. And October 7 and the Gaza war in particular, and if Israel continues with it and goes into Rafah and the picture becomes grimmer, should really make us think about that the impression of permanent stability under authoritarian rule, it has a break point. We may not see it, but we should not assume that it absolutely is fail-safe forever.
Well, fascinating conversation. That's it for today. Thomas Carothers, Vali Nasr, thank you.
Thank you. I enjoyed the conversation.
Yeah, thanks for inviting us. It was a great conversation.
This has been a presentation of the Middle East Institute. To support MEI's programs and podcasts, please donate at www.mei.edu. Thank you for your support.